Welcome. It just warms your heart to see all those photos. I want to thank everybody for coming to this very special celebration of our dear friend, Bryan Monroe. I'm Suzanne Malveaux. I'm a close friend of Bryan's from his early journalism days. I am just honored to be invited by the family to host this tribute to Bryan, along with another dear friend, Steve McKeever. The immediate Monroe family held a beautiful private Zoom memorial in January. They're in attendance today to watch this virtual remembrance, and I'd like to recognize them now. His dad, Major General James Monroe, Dunya Monroe, children Shauna and Jackson, fiance Abe Anderson, Tahira Hope Bias, April Thomas, and the many official and unofficial godchildren that Bryan took under his wings, including Sydney, Amber, and Soleil, and anybody who called him Uncle Bryan. And of course, we know that Bryan is reunited, hanging out with his mom, Charlene, again, who's with us in spirit. Thank you very much for just sharing this precious time with us, and of course, sharing Bryan too.
As another close friend and really a brother from another mother, I'm honored to be asked by the family to co-host as well. And frankly, being asked to co-host with Suzanne is like being picked to be on a basketball team with LeBron James. So I'm really excited to be here for this special event. Today's event is our collective way of honoring LeBron in a way that he would have loved. I'm actually sitting in his favorite spot of our house where he spent countless hours contemplating and kind of recharging his spirit. And even before we've really begun, I could feel his presence, and it's clear that Bryan has had his hands in the work of pulling everything together today. The first speaker, I'm really happy to introduce to everyone here, Omarosa Manigault Newman, who's a close friend of Bryan, as everybody on here knows. And I want to toss to you, Omarosa.
First of all, I want to say thank you, Suzanne and Steve. He just adored both of you all, but also to Bryan's family, to his beautiful fiance, Abe, to his wonderful children, Shauna and Jackson. I just send my love from Florida. I want to open up with a prayer, if you don't mind. Everyone, wherever you are, just bow your heads. Eternal Father, we come to you and we just thank you for today. We thank you that a life that you gave was a life so well lived and touched so many people. God, your word said, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. God, we ask for comfort today as we remember our friend. He's a father, a husband, a son, a brother, a cousin, a confidant. But more importantly, God, we just thank you that you blessed us with Bryan Monroe. We give you honor and praise throughout this service, and everyone in agreement just say amen.
Amen.
Anytime you invite a Baptist preacher to come speak, I always think it's important to introduce a word. And so I have chosen today 1 Samuel, the 20th chapter, the 16th and the 18th verse, which simply says, and Jonathan had David reaffirm his oath out of love for him, because he loved him as he loved himself. Then Jonathan said to David, tomorrow is the new moon feast. You will be missed because your seat will be empty. And I was thinking about what my best memories was sitting at the table after Bryan cooked for you. And he could just cook. He was a talented baker, chef, but more importantly, he was a great hostess. And I think about breaking bread with Jerry and a long list of people who are on here. But the thing that I remember the most is my husband, Pastor Newman, and myself sitting at the table with Abe and Bryan and Shauna and Jackson probably sleeping on the couch with Shuey running around, and just how happy he was. Everyone enjoying his cooking, and how mad I was with him in one of the meals because I was trying to stay off of carbs, and he baked one of his famous banana bread and brought the loaf out hot. But there were three moments that caused a twinkle in his eye, and I will keep it brief because I'm recognizing the time. The first was at the correspondence dinner, and Abe came to my room. We decided to get glammed up, and the moment that Bryan saw Abe transformed with, this glamorous red carpet makeup and hair, he had this very special twinkle in his eye. The second time was when we went up and Jackson was graduating from military school, and I got to be the speaker for his award ceremony. And as they list all of these amazing accomplishments that Jackson had, Bryan was just so proud. And he had this incredible twinkle in his eye. But more importantly, for Shauna's prom, he let me and Shauna go by ourselves to go pick out the prom dress. But he gave us very clear specifications of what the prom dress needed to look like, how it couldn't cut a certain way. And so when we went, he just kept texting us, what are we looking at? Send us a copy of the dress, let me see. And when Shauna got her hair and her makeup done, and she put on her prom dress, and he looked at her, there was that twinkle again in his eye. And so I guess what I'm gonna miss the most is those moments that just made Bryan happy and smile. And as the scripture said, the chair will be empty, but Bryan truly will be missed because he is loved by all of you. And so Suzanne and Steve, thank you for letting me share my 3 favorite moments of Bryan.
Thank you, Omarosa. Thank you very much. It was so beautiful. I'd like to ask for Sharon Illstrop. She's a friend from Clover Park High School to speak next.
Ooh, that's tough to start off from. Thank you for this opportunity to speak about my best friend, Bryan. Although he was never, ever Bryan to me, he's always been Bubba. My name is Sharon Illstrop, and I've known Bubba since junior high. We've been best friends for over 40 years. We lived in the military town of Washington State, Lakewood, Washington, which, as our dear friend Juanita so beautifully wrote recently, is located between 2 military bases. And for many of our classmates, it was the first place we were able to stay put long enough to call home and form friendships. Many of us are still extremely close 40 years later. We cherish these friendships, knowing how lucky we are to have roots. And this won't surprise anyone on here. Bubba, even though he lived across the country, was the catalyst who brought us all together when he came to town. As long as I've known Bubba, he's had a camera around his neck. He was back then what the smartphone is today, everywhere, always pointing that thing at you, and you were never safe and had to be on your best behavior, or you would show up in the yearbook or Cloverleaf, our little newspaper in high school. Our high school was built as a result of the World War II military boom. And this is where Bubba got his first big photojournalism break, which I believe is what lit the fire of passion for journalism. That pun is definitely intended. In February of 1981, we were in English class when fire alarms started blaring. Although they were malfunctioning that day, it's frankly a miracle no one was killed. We were all evacuated from our high school and sent to stand across the street. On the way out of class, Bubba grabbed his bag, which had his camera in it, and I'm pretty sure it was his very first camera, his Pentax K1000. We watched in horror mixed with excitement because, it was high school, as black smoke and flames poured from the roof, totally engulfing our school, mainly the gym and the music room. And there was Bubba with his camera capturing photos of the flames as they billowed from what used to be the roof. Those photos were published in our little school newspaper and also in our town paper, and that was his very first paid gig. Bubba was that one friend who was always there for me. There will never be another. We stayed in close touch over the years, texting and talking almost every week. I was lucky enough to meet Tahira when their kids, Sean and Jackson, were very young, and we have stayed very close. I'm also extremely grateful that Bubba came out last Valentine's Day with Abe, and we had a big group lunch in Seattle with our friends. It was wonderful to see him so happy and so in love again. We were joking over chat 2 days before his death about what we were going to wear as each other's dates to the virtual inauguration. He was so happy with how that election turned out. Bubba was a rare force who could not only bring people together even after life, but also forge deep friendships with each of us. Sometimes you don't realize the massive impact someone has on your life until they're gone. There will never, ever be another Bryan Monroe. His death leaves a hole that just can't be filled. So much love to you, Shauna, Jackson, Abe, and Tahira.
Well, I'd like to, that was beautiful. both you, Omarosa and Sharon. It's an unbelievable way to start us off. I'd like to bring up right now a friend of his from the University of Washington, Matt Titcomb.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Matthew Titcomb, Brian's UW college friend and roommate, and friend for a long time. First, I want to say, my thoughts and prayers have been with you with Tahira, Shauna, Jackson, Abe, Danya, and Mr. Monroe. So I have three different thoughts over time because Brian and I stayed in contact over time. One was broken down in decades and then to the century. In the 80s, college. Brian and I were roommates. We met at the dorm at UW and became roommates for multiple years. We shared a house with Dave Vincent, and our friends were like Julia, Tammy, Daryl, and too many to remember. Some memories were blown speakers from one night at the house with Dave, going to Dick's nearby for some late night burgers, watching Brian and Big Tom being young, dumb, and stupid in a not so big room in our house. The other memorable parts were his cars. I remember the big blue, and I don't know what it was, if it was a Cadillac or Lincoln, whatever, but he brought it to school his freshman year, and that was great. That got replaced by a tan Chevette, which he made more money from people hitting it than it cost him. And yeah, I'm the guy who, during one spring break, brought him home to his parents, and we shoveled manure together for my dad's lawn. Some memories of time at UW was CNN was God's gift to Brian, it seemed like. Also, the daily and learning life's lessons. He was already a multimedia news and information junkie, which was amazing. In the 90s, we got together to see UW various times at the Rose Bowl and other games. One game, it was like in October 91, we saw UW play Cal when he was living in San Jose, and stayed overnight somewhere in Berkeley, I don't remember. On our way home, we stopped by Jack London Park in Oakland and looked like a tire fire. And that tire fire actually turned out to be the Oakland fire of 1991. For those not old enough to remember that was a big fire. You can look it up in Google. Needless to say, the newsman came out and I was dropped off early at the airport. We both got married and became fathers. And Brian was my daughter's godfather, my daughter Sydney. I was a groomsman in his wedding. It was beautiful. In the 21st century, we still stayed in contact by text and phone. He was the last person I saw before this unique year shut things down when I was in DC area. Brian was my guy on the inside of politics. It was kind of fun to talk to him. And he was part of my sanity check network. And we spoke just days before he passed. I'll miss Brian. And he'll always be a part of me. And that was a good part.
I want to bring in Lauri Hennessey. She's with the UW Daily. It's the college newspaper.
My name is Lauri Hennessey, and I am coming to you from Vashon Island, which is near Seattle. And I met Brian in 1984. That was a long time ago. We were friends when Madonna came on the scene, when Bruce first sang about being born in the USA. Brian and I worked at the UW Daily together. In fact, I remember dancing with Brian and a bunch of our friends at a party as September played. So that was perfect when you started this with September. I know it's a song he loved. My memories of Brian are mostly about him carrying 100 camera bags behind him at the Daily. I remember his laugh, which I always found to be a bit maniacal, almost with a bit of an evil genius feel to it. And I remember him talking a lot about Germany. In fact, that's why at the Daily we called him the Wall. That was his nickname, because we thought it was so cool. He had been in Germany. Every time that he would hustle into the newsroom with camera bags flying in all directions, we all would cue each other and yell, "Wall!" really big. And there's a lot of graffiti still at the UW Daily about the wall, on the walls at the Daily. And Bryan went back, I think, a year or two ago and took some pictures and did a little memory lane trip, which there was a photo shown earlier in the slideshow about. Of course, the fact that he was a big guy made the nickname kind of perfect. He went on to be the editor later after I left the Daily, and everyone describes him from the old days as charismatic, inspiring, and extremely motivational. One of my classmates from back then shared a story about Ben Linder. He was a 1983 UW graduate who was killed by the US-backed guerrilla fighters in Nicaragua. Bryan was the editor, and the rest of the team were able to reach someone on site in Nicaragua for an interview and crank out a cover story overnight. The next day, they learned that the little UW Daily had scooped the entire national media on the incident with Bryan driving it. Bryan visited me once in DC when I lived there 30 years ago. I think he might have been in Myrtle Beach at the time. I know it was before he lived near DC. And he and I were walking down the mall. He was carrying about 1,000 cameras. And I remember he just kind of shook his head and said, "This wouldn't be so bad working here." He'd had a big grin on his face. And of course, he laughed. And I just had no idea that he would end up being there and doing so much and knowing so many people and making so many important changes. The years flew. We drifted a little bit, I think, just because our lives are busy. And I hate how that happens with old friends, but I'm so glad we reconnected a few years ago. And since then, we mainly talked about politics, vented, but also a lot about kids. He felt such pride as a dad. And when Jackson found his voice in protest, Bryan was just constantly texting, here's a link to another interview he's doing. My son actually got kind of sick of it because I would go to my son and say, you have to be protesting more. Look at my old college friend's son. It was really wonderful to watch from afar. And on Bryan's advice, my son now attends Temple. So we were choosing between two schools, and I texted Bryan and said, my son's trying to decide about whether he should go to Temple. And he said, what's the main thing he's deciding? And I said, he's grown up in an entirely white island and it bothers him. And he wants to go somewhere where he'll actually experience a bit of diversity in his life. And Bryan said, send him here. Not only will he experience some diversity, but I'll become a Black friend for him. And they kept meaning to meet together. And I really was excited about having lunch with Bryan when I got back to visit Will, and we ran out of time. So every person from the UW Daily chapter of Bryan's life thinks of him with such pride as our old classmate who made it big. And we're all just incredibly proud of the Wall, and I'll miss him. Thank you.
I had never heard of that, the Wall. It's a great nickname. Thank you, Abe, for inviting me to share my memories as well. I met Bryan when we were young 20-somethings who were both enthusiastically pursuing our careers as journalists, rising through the ranks. We shared a passion for people and storytelling and journalism with a capital J. And I really loved being around Bryan. He just oozed confidence, and you might have noticed a little bit, he had a little swagger. Bryan was my wingman for so many events, big and small, the White House Correspondents' Dinners, the before parties, the after parties, the in-between parties, and of course, NABJ. And despite my public persona, I was always a bit shy about meeting new people. Bryan would just take my hand, he'd walk me straight up to anybody and introduce me. George Clooney, Queen Latifah, I mean, just anybody. He wasn't shy or timid. You could make a new connection, a new friend. That was really his superpower. He was amazing at connecting people, as he's connected all of us today. Several years ago, he connected me to an amazing group, the International Women's Media Foundation. He was a leader on the board. He wanted me to join him. We were very excited about the new ideas that we wanted to implement throughout the year, the newly selected co-chairs of the board. Bryan was the only Black man on the board. He was very comfortable in his role as an advocate for female journalists. And I always just loved our Amtrak rides together, to the board meetings, to New York. It just gave us uninterrupted time to talk. And he would always bump me up to first class. We'd sit together. He had a gazillion points. And he was always generous with what he had as well as his time. And I think many of you know he was very much into upgrading his friends. And for me, that meant high tech. He spent many hours in my house trying to make everything smarter. Me, my TV, my Wi-Fi, my heater. We used to joke that every time he came to our house, he'd leave with one thing fixed and then another thing was broken because we didn't know how to use it. He was the only person in the house who had set it up and understood the tech behind it. There was a time I actually called Bryan to change the temperature in my living room because he was the one who set it up on his cell phone. I'm sure, Abe, you can relate. Ironically, there are still some things that are broken in my house that I am not ready to fix because that belonged to Bryan. As close friends, we shared Thanksgivings and birthday parties, our mom's burials, countless brunches, big events, small, quiet disappointments. When he came to CNN, our offices were right next door to each other. And when that gig ended, he showed by example how to pivot gracefully to turn disappointment into opportunity when he embraced teaching. Bryan was a giver, not a taker. When my parents were sick, Bryan was there for all of the family gatherings, maybe to pick up the ice or throw the chicken on the grill, make a batch of his famous margaritas, or lead us down the Soul Train line or jump into the wobble. When I became a new mom, my whole household fell in love with Bryan. Everyone wanted to snuggle with him. Our big golden retriever occupied the left side of Bryan's lap, and our infant daughter, Soleil, would sleep on his right side. And Bryan stayed at our house for hours on end, perhaps because he was trapped on the couch. I don't know, taken hostage by our growing family. Bryan didn't give much oxygen to grudges or negativity or self-pity. We confided in each other over the years about our personal struggles. He was always straightforward, strong, and yet soft-spoken. He wept openly when he called to tell me his mom had passed away. He laughed heartily when we danced in the audience on the set of The View. And over the past several years, I marveled at how incredibly happy Bryan had become meeting Abe, blending their two families together under one roof, 4 kids, 2 humongous dogs, and lots of love. Bryan was my confidant and accountability partner. So we were always checking in with each other. He called me on Monday after he'd gotten back in town from his special 2-week vacation with Abe in Florida. And then he called me again on Tuesday. Tuesday night, we talked about how excited we were to get started as the IWMAF's board new co-chairs. And we talked about our families and our goals for the year after we would emerge from this quarantine, this COVID quarantine. And I ended the conversation thanking Bryan for being such a good friend. It was a very ordinary conversation. I was always thanking Bryan for being such a good friend. Bryan died the next morning, some 12 hours later. And it took me weeks before I was able to tell my 6-year-old daughter, Soleil, about his passing, because they too were very close. And when I did tell her, she saw how sad I was. I asked her if she understood. And she said, yes, Bryan was like a dad to me and like a brother to you. And I said, that's right. You got it. You will always be with me.
Wow, Suzanne, that's remarkable and touches everyone here because I'm so glad you brought up his superpowers because Bryan had so many, from Wi-Fi fixer to cook. I mean, the list I'm sure we keep hearing about, but that's really powerful. You touched me quite deeply with your words, as everyone else has spoken. The next speaker is a really close friend from the San Jose Mercury News, David Yarnold.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks to Bryan's family and friends. It's an honor to be here with all of you. At the Mercury News, Bryan was a magnet for talent. He created a training ground for visual journalists who went on to run their own publications, just as he did. That may not sound like a big deal to those of you who don't know the American newspaper landscape, but we were the only newspaper where that actually happened. It was another way that Bryan led, because visual journalists were, at most newspapers, second-class citizens, but not at the Mercury News. Predictably, he showed those he recruited to be fearless. Surprised? Even about doing the jobs like writing that they weren't supposed to be able to do. He helped the Mercury News become a national and global leader. The International Society for News Design named the Mercury News one of the 5 best designed newspapers in the world on Bryan's watch. They called us America's boldest newspaper. Are you surprised that with Bryan at the lead, that's what they called us?
Okay.
And Bryan was our inspiration. In a way, he worked without boundaries at the Mercury News. We saw him at his full powers, designing, writing, editing, inspiring, conducting the orchestra. He was the maestro. We were the grown-ups, and amazingly, we were in charge. And we had big fun. I remember pay-per-view boxing nights at Bryan's apartment. Lots of cigars, lots of scotch, not a lot of sleep. I had the opportunity to talk to Bryan the week that he passed. We found there was an opportunity that had arisen that he was really excited about. It was a perfect fit. And so when Shauna called me to tell me about Bryan's passing, it was beyond shocking, heartbreaking. As we stayed in touch over the years, whenever we talked, the lead was the same. The lead was always Shauna and Jackson. He was so proud of them, so proud of you, as we are. We're going to miss him deeply.
Thank you, David. Our next speaker is Jerry Sappas of Knight Ridder.
Good, thank you. And thank you, Abe, for including me today. My kids grew up with Bryan, so I found it interesting what my son said when I told him that Bryan had died. Matt said to me, I remember Bryan as having a belly laugh that came from the core of his being. That's how I remember Bryan too, with a belly laugh that convinced any skeptic that Bryan was on your side. That's how he persuaded traditional journalists that there might be a more creative way to tell a story, or that new media, as we called it back in those days, was indeed the future of journalism, or that diversity in the newsroom might, believe it or not, actually be a good thing. I was vice president for news of Knight Ridder. When our friend Larry Olmsted was promoted, I knew that I wanted Bryan to take over Larry's job, working with about half of our 32 daily papers, with me working with the other half. As I suspected, it was the perfect match. With that belly laugh helping, Bryan played both editor and professor way before he even was a professor, and I never second guessed my choice, especially on the day that Stan Tyner, the editor of the Sun Herald in Biloxi and Gulfport, Mississippi, called me at home as Hurricane Katrina came ashore. Stan said 3 words: we need help. As it happened, I was retiring from Knight Ridder, I think the next day or very close to it. So of course I called Bryan. What else would I do? Before I could ask him to head to Biloxi and really to head to great danger, he was packing and figuring out where to buy the equipment that eventually allowed the paper to publish and to win a Pulitzer Prize. I have so many memories of Bryan's warmth and talent, and also of a scary memory of taking him to the hospital in Washington, D.C. when he was in a diabetic coma some years ago. But rather than go over memories from the past, I have breaking news of what Bryan is doing this very day. I hear that he's hanging out with our former boss, Bob Engel, who died 12 days ago. If my information is correct, Bryan and Bob are working on some technological problem, and my sources say that these two giant innovators in the history of journalism, giant, have agreed on a solution to the problem. And you know, that's why I can hear Bryan's belly laugh right now from far away. Thank you.
That was beautiful. Our next speaker is Susan Smith Richardson. She had a conflict, so she submitted a video for us to share with everyone.
I'm Susan Richardson, and I'm honored to say a few words about Bryan on behalf of the Newman class of 2003. The Newman year is a really special year. It's a time of reflection, both personal and professional. But you know, if you're really lucky, your journalism colleagues and classmates become your lifelong friends. Bryan was our friend. When we all started together in the fall of 2002 at 1 Francis Avenue, some of us were a little in awe of Bryan. He was already a senior executive at Knight Ridder, and in the first few months of the fellowship, he got another promotion. One of our classmates said, "Wow, he's really big time." He was big time, but the man wasn't the title. Bryan and Tahira were always the first to open up their house for parties or gatherings, and then they'd just kick back on Sundays, invite some of us over to watch HBO, and just relax watching some of our favorite TV shows. It was just chill. One of the traditions of the Newman year is a thing called the sounding. And this is where you get to tell everybody your life story, talk about your family, talk about how you got into journalism, and then you get to brag a little bit about some of your journalistic accomplishments. Well, you know, most of us just got up there with a few slides and did a lot of talking. We had one guy who kind of set the bar when he pulled out his guitar and started singing some songs. But it wasn't until Bryan's sounding that we all realized what a real presentation was like. He had music, he had videos, he had slides. It was an extravaganza and everything was perfectly synced. Well, just suffice to say, nobody wanted to go after Bryan. Bryan always did it up big. He lived big. And during that year, he inspired us all to up our game, to go bigger in our careers. Thinking back on 2003, I found this mug that we all got as we left. One of our classmates' wives decided that we needed to have the mugs to seal our bond. I'm holding that mug in memory of that special year and in memory of Bryan. To his family and to his loved ones from the Newman class of 2003, he'll always be an inspiration.
Thank you. And next is Myra Lowe of Ebony Magazine.
Knowing Bryan Monroe meant knowing a man who believed in seizing the moment. Becoming the first vice president and editorial director of Ebony and Jet magazines in 2006, Bryan sought to make both publications more urgent and vital. And as a result, he and his editorial teams seized many moments. He's been credited with re-energizing the brands by recruiting a team of Black journalists from mainstream media, including myself, to join Johnson Publishing Company. And we, alongside those who were there before us, fearlessly expanded coverage and audiences. My husband, Herbert Lowe, who you'll hear from a little bit later, wrote in his tribute piece for the undefeated.com that Bryan got Ebony and Jet ready for the Obama moment. Yes, he surely did. We covered every step of Barack Obama's historic run for the White House, his election, and his inauguration. Ebony was the first printed publication to land an in-person interview with Obama just days after he won the presidency. Black media rose in the era of Obama, and Bryan led our path in that trajectory. We have at last an equal seat at the table, he said. Other groundbreaking moments included interviewing Michael Jackson for the 25th anniversary of Thriller. Many of you may have heard he was the last person to interview Michael Jackson before he died. I know some of you are laughing at that. We also celebrated Black men in a multi-cover Black Cool edition that featured 25 of the coolest brothers of all time. We shone a holistic light on the continent of Africa and joined former President Bill Clinton on a tour of 4 African countries. And we engaged Black America in a critical conversation about race, language, and the culture of disrespect. Bryan wasn't afraid for us to take a stand. He pushed us to be strong in our perspectives and to advocate for our voices to be heard. And through it all, what I remember the most about our moments at Ebony and Jet is the immense pride and satisfaction we felt telling the stories of our time that mattered to the Black community, and that we were a part of John H. Johnson's undeniable legacy. Thank you, Bryan, for that opportunity. And in his memory, let us all continue to seize the moment. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much. That was wonderful. Our next speaker is Khalila Ali, who's a dear friend who has something to share with all of us.
Hi, good afternoon. You know, one thing Bryan knew most about me was that I was almost never at a loss for words. And this is the first time in my life that they just don't flow easily. But what I am very present to is the size of my heart right now. And listening to everyone who I heard about over the years and never had the opportunity to meet in Bryan's life, to hear the continuous reflections of who he was, his love, his passion, his positivity. Bryan reminded me so much of my father, who was also larger than life. You know, I'm always amazed by how many people I meet, and somehow my father had met too and had such love and bonds to him. And I'm learning Bryan's the same way. His heart was so big and the gift he had to give was just endless. I feel so honored and privileged to have met him in this lifetime and to have him as my brother, as I used to refer to him as. You know, as Suzanne said, he certainly was the keeper of my secrets, my dreams, the most intimate information about me. And when he couldn't get it, he'd be very upset and tell me I was burying the lead again. We hadn't spoken quite some time. The first thing he'd say to me is, "Where are you burying the lead?" And I, being the relentless person I am, I'd make him hunt for it. And you better believe he got every story that he wanted. Knowing Bryan for almost 18 years, one of the most wonderful moments was the night he called me and he finally met Abe. And just how happy he was. To know Bryan is to know Abe. It was the first time that he met a woman, and I heard about every woman, every date, that matched his love and reciprocated the kind of love that he had to give. And I am so grateful that before he left this earth, that he had that in someone, that he was gifted and rewarded with all the love that he's given all of us through Abe. One of my last emails, and by the way, my nickname for him was Ibry because of technology, and I'm completely useless without him. In fact, I'm surprised I even made it onto this today, was an email where we were looking at rings, you know, for Abe. And our last physical conversation, we exchanged a whole round of I love yous multiple times. And I'm just so grateful that I had that opportunity. I don't really have anything particularly eloquent to say today other than to express my love and also grief for losing someone that's going to be completely irreplaceable in every way possible. And my gratitude to his entire family for allowing me in. And my love to all of you, because I know how my heart feels and I can't imagine what you all have gone through. But at the same time, Bryan taught everyone wisdom and strength, and you have absolutely exuded that, especially Shauna and Jackson. So just my love to everyone and my absolute gratitude for this opportunity. And I'm going to sit back and continue to enjoy and listen to these wonderful messages and celebration of a life of a man well lived. Oh, and by the way, one more thing. I wonder if he said this to anyone else. Bryan always told me if something ever happens to me to never, ever let people think he didn't live a full life. He said, you get there and you make sure that you tell people he lived a wonderful full life. And I think that we can all see that today. But I also did want to share that message because I know that that was very important to Bryan as well. My love to everyone, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Really, and indeed, he did live a very full life, and he loved you. Elisa Les Munoz of IWMF is next, a good friend of mine, and as well as the board.
Thank you, Suzanne. Bryan was a board member of the IWMF for nearly 8 years and co-chair for 2. And I know how much he was looking forward to serving as chair with Suzanne this year. We're extremely sad that that wasn't able to happen. His contributions to the IWMF are immeasurable. Most of all, Bryan's wisdom, contagious enthusiasm, and friendship will be terribly missed. Bryan contributed in so many ways to our activities. His insights and level-headedness always made us better. I can't remember an IWMF event that Bryan did not attend in person. From board meetings in New York to Courage in Journalism Awards ceremonies in Los Angeles and even Berlin, Bryan was always there. I'll never be able to get on an Amtrak again without thinking of our commutes to board meetings with him and Suzanne. On one such return, he got all of the IWMF staff who attended the meeting into the Amtrak VIP lounge. You can imagine it was a riot. His contributions helped us to transform the IWMF, and he always encouraged us to take risks and to think big, and not to take any crap from anybody. In this year of transition and conflict for the country, Bryan helped us to deliver for journalists who needed us most on the ground. Whether making margaritas on the West Side, much more than a board member. I considered him a mentor and a friend, as he was for so many. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. A lot of great memories in those meetings and rides. I'd like to bring forward CNN Sam Feist, who also was an integral part of his life.
Hi, everybody. I worked with Bryan at CNN, but our friendship started long before and lasted long after. And Suzanne, you and I share a problem that Bryan had a hand in. My Wi-Fi has been struggling, and because he set it up, I have no idea how to fix it. So I'll just have to do with that on my own. I met Bryan in Chicago when he was editor of Ebony and Jet. We became fast friends, and we'd connect when I was in Chicago or when he was in DC. And a few years later, CNN was looking to hire an editor for our new digital politics team. And I told the editor-in-chief that she had to meet this fella, Bryan Monroe. She did, and instantly fell in love, which should be of no surprise to anybody who can hear my words today. I was beaming from ear to ear when I learned that he was going to be joining us in the CNN Washington bureau. I think that what struck everybody at CNN, and dare I say everybody who knew him, is that he was just such a remarkable bridge builder. Suzanne called him a great connector. He would bridge teams, he would bridge groups, families, obviously was one of the great bridge builders between folks of different races. I've never met someone who could so easily put everyone in a room at ease. He would always find a way to connect with whomever he was talking about or talking with. If you grew up in a military family, check. If you had ever traveled to the Northwest, check. If you had ever lived overseas, check. If you had worked for a newspaper, check. If you were from any minority group at all, check. If you were a computer geek, check. Audio geek, check. If you like to grill fish on a cedar plank, check. If you love photography, check. Ever own a German car? Check. He would size you up, figure out his connection, and then the two of you were on your way. Ahead of every election, Bryan and I would do a dog and pony show around CNN in various cities, telling parts of the organization what we were planning with CNN politics for the election. I was the TV guy, he was the digital guy. And so when we were in front of a new group, we would be standing on a stage or in front of the room, and Bryan would always start off. And he would start off just with what sounded like a little story. He would say, "What a great country this is. Isn't it amazing that neither of the two people who run CNN's political coverage were born in the United States?" He would continue, "One of us was born in Trinidad and one of us was born in Germany. And yet here we are, never prouder than to be people to help help Americans pick their next leader." And of course, as you can imagine, everyone in the room automatically jumps to their conclusions. The black guy named Monroe was, of course, born in Trinidad, they thought, and the white Aryan-looking guy named Feist, that's me, was, of course, born in Germany. And so we would go about our presentation about CNN politics, and then at some point, Bryan would detect maybe the group needed a moment to wake up or change the subject, and he would find a place to interrupt, and he would say, "Hey, Sam, how was it that you were born in Trinidad?" And of course, the group would look confused. They would start to murmur because they had already decided the black guy was from Trinidad, the white German guy was from Germany. And that was Bryan. He loved to mess with people. He loved to break molds. He loved to break misconceptions. And even more important, he loved to build bridges. He was as comfortable with a group of all white colleagues as he was with a group of all black colleagues. And he did more to mesh the two than anyone I've ever met. Before I finish, I want to make sure you hear from Bryan himself, his words. In the final piece he wrote for CNN.com, he wrote about the racial reckoning that our country has been going through over the last year. And he had a clear message for white people like me. The headline of the piece was, "America needs white people to step up." And here's what Bryan wrote. Quote, his words. "So right now, what can you do about it? As a start, you can open yourself up to our daily reality. Listen with your mouths closed and your hearts open as your black friends talk about what they deal with every day. Yes, we can help you become aware, but we can't help you understand. Read great works like White Fragility. Why is it so hard for white people to talk about racism? By anti-racist educator Robin DiAngelo, or Dr. Martin Luther King's Letter from a Birmingham Jail, or just do a Twitter search for the hashtag White People's Homework. White people, this one is on you. You are in positions of power. You are the ones who can be the change. Do not let this opportunity slip by. America needs you to step up." Ladies and gentlemen, I have never met a person better able to deliver those words than Bryan Monroe. His life was indeed not long, but boy, was it full. Rest in peace, my friend.
Thank you, Sam. I really appreciate that. I'd like to bring David Boardman of Temple University.
Thank you. I'm the Dean of the Klein College of Media and Communication at Temple. First, I send my love and condolences to Abe and Shauna, Jackson, General Monroe, Danya, and the rest of Bryan's family. And I want to thank them for creating a scholarship fund at Bryan's name at Temple so that talented young people can follow in his footsteps. I had the privilege of knowing Bryan for 35 years, which means I'm older than most of you, but it was a time when I was a young editor at the Seattle Times, and he was a photojournalism intern from the University of Washington, which was one of my alma maters. So we bonded over UW Husky sports, and over the years we stayed in good touch. We would see each other in person only once or twice a year, usually at an NABJ or an AS&E convention. But it would always begin with one of the big man's enveloping bear hugs and always end with "Go Dogs." Over those years, I watched with just tremendous pride as I saw Bryan rise through the ranks to become a journalism superstar, helping make the Merc the best regional newspaper in America in the 90s, helping lead the Biloxi paper to a Pulitzer, as we've heard, reinvigorating Ebony and Jet, and helping shape the political coverage at CNN. at each of those stops, Bryan was a superb journalist, certainly, but more than that, and one thing I picked up on very early on, Bryan was a superb teacher. And it was that skill that made him one of the most effective leaders in the history of the National Association of Black Journalists. He was as passionate as anybody about advocating for better coverage of underrepresented communities and for the elevation of journalists of color in America's newsrooms. And I know that beneath the surface, he was as pissed off as anyone about the profession's slow progress in that regard. But even then, Bryan was in many ways Professor Monroe. He was a man who used his extraordinary personal skills in teaching the mostly white guys leading newsrooms, of which then I was one, why these changes were crucial for journalism and for our business survival. As it turned out, some of us white editors were better students than others. And while we made some progress, it clearly wasn't enough. But I saw again what a great teacher Bryan was, and it stuck with me. So a few years later, when I left my job as editor of the Seattle Times to become a dean at Temple University in Philadelphia, I knew one man I wanted on our faculty. Fortunately, during the interview process, our faculty search committee agreed, and in 2015, we made Bryan an offer he couldn't refuse. Bringing Bryan to Temple was a point of just great joy and pride for me. His office was right down the hall from mine, and we continued to kibitz about newspapers, our many mutual friends, and the Washington Huskies. He loved our college, our university, our students, and his Klein College of Media and Communication colleagues. And they loved him. Each semester, Bryan's students were enthralled from day one when he told them that story we've all heard countless times, that he was the first person to interview Barack Obama after he was elected president and the last person to interview Michael Jackson before he died. But as you can imagine, with a bunch of 18 and 19-year-olds, they were hooked. And not that his classes were easy. In a remembrance that a couple of students wrote for the Temple News, they said his law and ethics class was like being in law school, with Bryan making a Socratic method circle around the entire class. Just like at one of his barbecues, nobody got away without having a turn to speak. Bryan's last bid project at Temple was co-leading a Klein College task force performing a content and culture audit for the Philadelphia Inquirer, focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. That superb work is getting national attention and will undoubtedly help push that organization and many others forward in coverage and representation. Again, more teaching by Bryan Monroe. As another of his students said, quote, "He was one of those professors who really wanted you to understand and grasp the material. I couldn't be more thankful and grateful to have learned from Professor Bryan Monroe." Me too. Me too. I love you, brother Bryan. Rest in power. Go Dogs.
Thank you. Everyone has done such an unbelievable job in capturing Bryan, and so familiar because we've all suffered such a loss with such a great friend. The next friend that's going to speak to us is Antoinette Crosby, who is unfortunately had a family emergency and was able to put a video together for us right now.
I miss Bryan so much. It's hard to even talk about him in the past tense. You know, it's what I've been saying since losing Bryan on January 13th, that I can't imagine a world without Bryan Monroe in it. But I'm honored that his beautiful love, Abe, who is now like a sister to me, has invited me to be here and talk about the Bryan that I knew, loved, and adored. And there are so many names that I recognize on this program because Bryan spoke so fondly of all of you throughout the years. Bryan, as we know, was a mover and shaker, and there was never a dull moment. Folks just wanted to be around him, even celebrities. So when he was a VP at Ebony, he invited me out to LA for Ebony's Oscar party. So I called my girl, Janice Armstrong of the Philadelphia Inquirer, and said, let's get out to LA and have some fun. It was a star-studded event with Halle Berry, Janet Jackson, and of course, Bryan being the consummate host. With his radiant energy, he made sure everyone was having a great time. He was in his element. Bryan was print and I was broadcast, but then one year we sort of switched. He was at CNN and I was at the Washington Post. We laughed at that. He was a huge asset to me. You know, I could go to him and ask him for any type of advice. And later, when I became an anchor at the Black News Channel up until his passing, he was giving me names of guests to have on my show because Bryan, as we know, knew everybody. Bryan was so much more than a best friend. He was my big brother. There were many ways over the years that he showed me his caring, brotherly side. Like the time he drove all the way to my condo to find a spider. And then there was the know me all too well side where he called and say, let's meet for drinks. Well, if I paused too long, he said, oh, never mind, you must be wearing your glasses and in pigtails. He laughed because he knew that I was in for the night. Bryan would often call or text and say, come by, I'm having a few people over. From his pool parties in San Jose to White House Correspondents' events, the Super Bowl party he co-hosted at Suzanne Malveaux's house, or a backyard barbecue. It didn't matter what it was always a blast. So I would walk into these events and it would be a who's who in media, but it was still chill, music playing, Bryan swaying, going from the grill to the kitchen with big plates of food. Folks just having a ball. Hey, we were at home. Over the years, Bryan would invite me to spend many holidays with him and his family. And I'll never forget the last Thanksgiving I spent with them. As a family, they were going through the painful loss of his beautiful mother. So there I was, Bryan at the head of the table, his dad, General Monroe, at the other end, Bryan's love Abe, and the kids, Jackson, Shauna, and Abbott. It was such a touching memory. Well, afterwards, I texted my mom that I had a great time and showed her the pictures of Bryan's fabulous homemade feast. She texted back, I am so happy that you had a glorious time. You deserve it. Is that Bryan's house? Because it looks like a 5-star restaurant. I am jealous. Oh, how my mama loved Bryan and he adored her. I am so thankful that I had a seat at Bryan's spectacular table no matter where it was. And so thankful that Bryan allowed me the honor of being in his phenomenal life. Bryan, I will love you forever.
I want to introduce an organization and the heads of an organization that Bryan was such an integral part of. That is the National Association of Black Journalists, NABJ. With us is Dorothy Tucker, Herb Lowe, and Akili Ramses, who would like to speak next.
Thank you. I'll take it first. I'm the current president of the National Association of Black Journalists. Bryan served from 2005 to 2007, but was with the organization for many years before that and stayed with us till the end. Bryan was NABJ's secret weapon. And those who served on the board with him when Bryan was president, they know what a smart leader he was. Fortunately for NABJ, Bryan was always an active commander. He helped spearhead major events like the Unity Convention in 2008, helping secure the keynote speaker, the presumptive presidential candidate Barack Obama. He moderated more panels, plenary sessions, and workshops than all of us put together in more than we can name. He secured new corporate partners for NABJ and used his connections to get the headline speakers for us. No task was too small and every task was handled with the Bryan touch, which meant thorough, efficient, and impactful. For me personally, Bryan was a friend. He was an advisor. He and I spoke often over the course of the last couple of years. He had a way of asking questions or setting up a scenario that forced you to think. So he never really gave you the answer. He just helped you make the right decision. And doing the right thing was very important to Bryan. Bryan was extremely protective of NABJ members, and every decision was about doing what was best for the majority. I still find myself sometimes when something comes up, that instinct to just want to pick up the phone and call Bryan, to ask a quick question, to chat for a minute. And that's something that I have to, it's a habit that's going to be difficult to break. Bryan loved NABJ, NABJ loved Bryan. I will miss my friend, but I'm grateful for the time we had and the impact he made in this organization. And I want to thank his family and all of his friends for allowing us, for sharing Bryan with us. Thank you.
I'll go next. Thank you, Abe. My heart goes out to you, Shauna, and Jackson, and Tahira. He leaves a big hole in all of our lives. To build on how I first met Bryan is how ties into how he looks for talent. I first met Bryan when I was on a motorcycle road trip across country, and friends convinced me to come stop in Chicago for the NABJ convention. And I hadn't been involved with NABJ since college. And I got up there, and here's this big man with that swagger coming at me. And I'm like, introduces, hey, I'm Bryan Monroe, and I work at San Jose Mercury News over visuals, and I want you to come work for us. I'm like, I was kind of taken aback. I said, let's talk about this. I said, I was already working in Atlanta, which is actually my family home, but we find that connection. I'm also a military brat, and my father was a captain in the Marine Corps, was a career Marine. And so there was that connection. But timing was bad. My oldest son was about to graduate high school, and he waited like another year and came after me to try and come to San Jose, which as a visual journalist, it was a destination paper. It was one of those newspapers as a photojournalist you wanted to work for. And he finally convinced me to come out for an interview. And part of the enticement was my husband and I were doing a commuter marriage thing. He was in LA and I'm in Atlanta. And he says, hey, get a chance for you guys to get together. I says, but I had a great interview and with the people, and I was really wanting this job. But as a military brat who got dragged across country every time my dad had a different posting, I knew I didn't want to do that to my son, who was then in his senior year. But Bryan was so intent on getting me to come to San Jose, he held that job for me for 9 months until my son graduated high school. And so I was able to, and the other enticement was that the fact that half the staff rode motorcycles too. In the first week on the job, like half the crew of us went out riding. I said, okay, I'm sold on this. But he was the kind of person who saw that talent in you and cultivated. The next thing he did, my introduction to NABJ after that was a month into being on the job. And he gets me to go to NABJ in Orlando. And we called Bryan, because Bryan, Michael Ducille, and Kenny Irby, who we call it the Visual Task Force, the Godfathers, somehow decided I was going to be the next Visual Task Force chair. And I had no idea. I said, I'm in a new job, Bryan. I don't know what I'm doing here. He says, we'll give you all the support you need, but we need fresh energy and fresh leadership. And I know you can do this. And that's the thing about Bryan. He would convince you, even if you weren't sure about yourself, to be able to step up and help build out a dream of bringing in other journalists of color, particularly Black journalists, are so rare, Black photographers. And as far up as he always went, he never forgot about the Visual Task Force. He always would come in to any of our sessions. He would always lend his support to activities. And it was very pivotal in my own development as a leader with this group. And I still have my connections, and I still help and advise young photojournalists that I started in student projects who are now directors of photography and staff photographers and visual editors. He was an amazing man, and I just don't know, and just a good friend. Started off as a boss, and then mentor, but more than anything, he was someone you could talk to and make you believe in the cause and being the best what you could be. And I'm gonna miss him. And there's more I can say than that. He was a beautiful man. So thank you.
And thanks to Abe, Shauna, Jackson, Tahira, General Monroe, all of his family for sharing Bryan with us all these years. Bryan was immensely proud of all of you, and rightfully so. So let me go back to circa 2000. Will Sutton was NABJ's president, and he, along with Candace Presley and I, as the two vice presidents, we were in a DC area conference room with several other NABJ members and staff there to discuss how to elevate NABJ's website. This was back when the internet was still in its infancy. At some point during the meeting, a man's voice came booming through a telephone speaker. He was dialing in from the West Coast, back when this was still quite unusual, long before Zoom. And this voice bellowed with such incredible clarity about how NABJ should do this about the website, how it should do that. Who was this man, I wanted to know. I was in awe of his confidence and intelligence. I hoped that I would get to hear that voice again. Well, as the saying goes, be careful what you ask for, because over the next 20 years, everyone at NABJ would hear Bryan's voice. As he pushed us all to be better journalists, as he pushed us all to be better Black journalists, as he pushed us all to be better journalists of color, all in the service of NABJ, and also Unity Journalists of Color. And as he would always say, in the service of journalism as an industry, and most importantly, in the service of our communities. So I got to hear his voice almost every day during my time as NABJ president from 2003 to 2005, when he was vice president of print. Well, I always wasn't sure at the time. Yes, there were days when I wanted to say, and this is putting it mildly, Bryan, please stop talking. Yes, you may be right. Of course you are right. Okay, you're right as usual. No question, I'm eternally grateful for his coaching and mentorship, as much for his friendship and brotherhood. Bryan was my younger brother, who acted like he was the older one. I still govern myself by leadership lessons Bryan taught me. I'm not trying to survive in journalism. I'm trying to thrive. You can be absolutely right and still be absolutely wrong. Always play out the videotape before making decisions. What is the problem you're trying to solve? Bryan always thought big picture, and he did so as NABJ president. And that was from 2005 to 2007, when he consistently advocated for more coverage of underrepresented communities and for journalists of color to have greater opportunities in newsrooms. But he also pushed NABJ to extend its influence internationally. And we could talk all night about how, as president, Bryan helped to force the ouster of Don Imus from his syndicated radio show after the shock jock had racially and shamefully disparaged the Rutgers University women's basketball team. And yet for many Black journalists, Bryan's professional accolades paled in comparison to the humanity he exuded in countless measures over the years. I won't soon forget how, the night he died, how 24 of us spent nearly 3 hours remembering Bryan on a Zoom call. It was incredibly joyous and heartbreaking, loving and cathartic, emotional and resolving for us to recall his friendship, his spirit, his encouragement, his generosity, his confidence, his leadership, his vision, his hugs, his love for his family, and yes, his willingness to pick up a check for expensive meals and alcohol. My hope was that Bryan and I would grow old together as past NABJ presidents, seeing each other at annual conventions, and continuing to mentor future journalism and organization leaders. But he was the youngest of the 6 past NABJ presidents to pass away. So he's sitting on the Heavenly Board of Directors alongside the groundbreaking journalists Chuck Stone, Vernon Jarrett, Les Payne, Tom Morgan, and Sid Mel Estes. No doubt, just as he did for so many of us over the years, Bryan is showing them how to use the latest digital technologies, the technology that we won't know about for still years to come. Rest in peace, my brother, Bryan Monroe. Thank you so much.
Our next up is a mentee of Bryan, which are so many, but one very special one is Marissa Mitchell.
Hi, everyone. I first want to thank you for this opportunity. And as always, send my love to Abe, the children, General Monroe. You all are beautiful, beautiful. And I think that you're really Bryan's ultimate legacy. I'm Marissa Mitchell. I met Bryan 12 years ago. At the time, I was a student, a grad student at Northwestern University. And I remember it like it was yesterday because an email came down that Bryan would be a visiting professor at school. And I immediately saw his name and went, Bryan Monroe, is that the Bryan Monroe who did the last interview with Michael Jackson? Because I'm a huge Michael Jackson fan. So I knew who he was. And once I found out, yes, it's that Bryan Monroe, I reached out once he started. We set up a meeting. I went to his office, and there we talked about Michael, music, journalism. I heard some of the audio from that interview, which was huge for me as an MJ fan. And he also called Quincy Jones and Sinbad, during the time that we were there together, and put them on speakerphone. So I was on cloud 9 at that point. And I remember telling him, like, wow, you met Michael Jackson. There's only one person I want to meet or see more than Michael. And he goes, well, who? And I said, Oprah Winfrey. And a week and a day later, I was sitting front row at the Oprah Winfrey show. I did not ask for that, but Bryan knew an attorney for Harpo and somehow worked that out so that I was able to enjoy that huge life moment for me as a journalist. I'm a working journalist and anchor now in DC. And that's when the friendship started. So after Northwestern, Bryan was a mentor for me through Tennessee, through Alabama, through Atlanta, Georgia, my hometown of Atlanta. He was there for every contract, talking me through, helping me even personally. I shared a lot of things with Bryan that to this day I haven't shared with anyone. He was a good friend of my family. He knew my father. My father passed in 2015. And so that's when our relationship went from mentor to big brother and then father figure. And fast forward to me coming to DC. I moved to DC in September of last year. And I started at a station that went through a lot of turmoil with talent that left. And it was tough. And I remember expressing that to Bryan. And to make my first day better, he paid for, and I believe it's Omarosa's makeup artist, to do my makeup for my first day. And along with that, when he merged households with Abe, he brought a lot of furniture over to my place. And I'm looking at a coffee table, lights, a sofa chair that Bryan gave me, many things over the years. But one thing to wrap this, I wanted to say, listening to all of you, I'm going, well, wow, how did Bryan have so much time? Because for someone to have been so busy, I felt like I had Bryan all to myself. He was a king of that. And I always want to be present. And I think that he was always present, and not just with us professionally and as friends, but with his family. His family meant everything. And I want to echo what Suzanne and others have said. Abe, I'm so glad that he met you and he had you and that love in the end, because I expressed that to Bryan too, that it was the happiest I had ever seen him. And I know that his love will continue to abide with you and the family. And so just thank you. But his legacy for me is to work hard, be your best, don't accept anything less than the best, And then make sure you bring your family and friends along for the ride. Thank you, Bryan.
Thanks, Marissa. He bragged about you endlessly, like he has every name on this list. I think I know because Bryan's bragged and bragged about him. So I feel like I know so many of you that I'm just hearing from, one-on-one for the first time. Like everybody here, I could speak hours about Bryan, and the family asked me to say a few words, and I'm like Kali, who spoke on how loss of Bryan has her speechless, even though never really much of a shortage for words. I'm the same way. I saw a chat in the chat room by Joe Madison that talked about how Bryan was in the middle of editing his book, and that's how I feel. Bryan was in the middle of everything I was doing. He's my editor. He's my voice. He always said everything I wanted to say better than I could say it. And so when it came time for me to think about what was I going to say, and I could talk for so long, I thought, wow, I would like to hear what Bryan would say. And so I told Abe, I agree with everyone who's on here, how much he loved you, loved her, and loved his family more than anything else. I said, I would like to find to be able to hear Bryan's voice. So the last big Zoom call we did was something he was very passionate about, which is a dream I had for music for this moment, and put together a group of Grammy members and some pretty illustrious folks. And Bryan took over and made this vision his own because of the two things that he was a true Renaissance man, but he was passionate about music and he was passionate about journalism. And this was one of this concept to sort of bring it together. So I thought I'd abdicate my speech for letting Bryan speak to all of us. So this is from our Zoom call. I don't know, Bibi, do you want to start off?
No.
Okay.
Let me kind of kick the door open. First of all, thank you everybody for joining us. I'm Bryan Monroe, and Steve, that's a great, wonderful introduction. I'll have to pay you later in food or something. I don't know. But
I'm surprised you don't have your Pulitzer sitting, in screen chat right now.
Oh goodness, I sent that to my mom years ago. We are at an amazing, challenging, difficult, mesmerizing, frustrating, engaging time in our lives. We know what's happening with this dreadful disease. We know what's happening politically in 25 days. We know, there's a hurricane bearing down on Louisiana as we speak. And through all this, we hope that Black Lives Matter. Through all of this, there's an important role that music plays, that music has played historically, continues to play, and will play in the future. And the analogy I make is my own profession, journalism. I'm a professor now at Temple University, but I'm a recovering daily journalist, CNN and Ebony and Knight Ridder and all this kind of stuff. But the role of journalism in this moment is critical. You would not have known that first Hope Hicks and then Donald Trump had coronavirus had it not been for a journalist, Jennifer Jacobs at Bloomberg, first broke the story about Hope Hicks that then led to the White House. They first denied it, then they confirmed it. Then it led to the confirmation of what was happening with the president. And I was telling folks earlier, I'm here in DC, and literally I'm actually in Bethesda, Maryland. Right across the street from me is Walter Reed National Medical Center. And so in the last week, we had quite a bit of traffic coming back and forth. And I see one of my good friends is on Joe Madison, the Black Eagle on Sirius XM. He's joining us. And I know he and Bibi are good friends. And Joe and I talk about this a lot, that the role of journalism in uncovering truth, shining a light, and engaging a conversation is critical. Music has that same responsibility. Music has the responsibility to affect us, to touch our soul, to illuminate these trying times in a way that nothing else can do emotionally, socially, intellectually. And that's what this conversation is today. This is probably the most you're going to hear out of me, because I really want to hear from all of you. We'll start with our 5 principles, but we're going to open this up to everyone the next hour or so to talk about and engage what is your responsibility and how do we make the creative spirit connect with these times. There are a lot of people that are doing it already right now, today, and we want to applaud and celebrate and amplify those voices. But we also want to encourage those who haven't yet stepped up in the way that we know we can. We want to find the next Marvins, the next Ninas, the next John Lennons, who can take music and use it to illuminate this moment.
It's so powerful to see and hear him like that. It's hard to break away.
Yeah, it is.
Very hard.
It's just it's still not reality to me, actually, that he's
No, it's
not
hard to imagine.
in part of this. 3 months or later, I still am not come to grips with that he is not. And I listened to that whole Zoom call, and it was so good to me to hear every word he said throughout. And I miss him like everybody on this call. We all shared super deep loss.
Steve, thank you for sharing that. That meant so much more than you can imagine, than just us speaking to hear Bryan. His dear
Well, he has been the producer, I'm sure. The super talented people who have been around. The fact that we've got his star friend, Suzanne, at the helm here. There's no question that the fact that I wanted Bryan's video played was Bryan screaming in my ear someplace. So I think the fact that this has gone so smoothly is Bryan is, there's no question. He's pulling strings.
I know that one of his friends that couldn't be here with us, who's so dear to him, is Donna Bird, and she wanted me to read a poem on her behalf. It is a poem called Epitaph, and it's by Myra Lowe. And so we're gonna conclude with that. And here it goes. When I die, give what's left of me away to children and old men that wait to die. And if you need to cry, cry for your brother walking the street beside you. And when you need me, put your arms around anyone and give them what you need to give me. I want to leave you something better than words or sounds. Look for me in the people I've known or loved. And if you cannot give me away, at least let me live on in your eyes and not your mind. You can love me most by letting hands touch hands, by letting bodies touch bodies, and by letting go of children that need to be free. Love doesn't die, people do. So when all that's left of me is love, give me away.
That's beautiful.
We would
I know Donna's heartbroken that she couldn't be here. They were so close.
We would just like to take this opportunity to thank everybody who has been a part of this beautiful, special celebration of Bryan's life. His voice, his message, his heart. We are all so fortunate to be a part of his life. And I know, Steve, we're ending with something that is one of Bryan's favorites, optimistic. It's a message that we all take with us as we learn to give and love each other the way that Bryan gave and loved us.